Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be talking to you about my final project. The lesson title for the project is Looking at the Lies We're Told in School. If I'm looking down, it's because I'm looking at my outline and my lesson plan, so sorry. But anyway, so yes, this project will help students to identify areas of schooling where they had a single perspective and looking at how they can change the single perspective in situations as they move forward through their education. So some of the objectives and the goals of the lesson are that students will be able to identify meaningful quotes about how race and curriculum interact, connect their own thoughts to quotes from Behind the Lies My Teacher Told Me podcast. They'll be able to look critically at their own educational history and decide areas where they have been taught single perspectives and see why this is an issue, as well as seeing how they can combat this in the future. And they will be able to create a resource for themselves and others about specific historical inaccuracies they've learned in the classroom. So that is a brief overview of the project, and I'll be going into more depth about those objectives a little bit later. But first, I wanted to talk about how I came up with this idea. So yeah, I think one thing that really stuck out to me across doing the journals, across readings, even in lecture and recitation, was looking at the fact that there are factual inaccuracies in history class specifically that we're taught, and we don't really know that they're inaccurate because they paint the subject in a better light. So I think the biggest example of this in the class, at least for me, was when we were learning about Brown versus Board of Education in lecture, and I had memorized the verdict of the case for AP Gov, but I hadn't really learned much else about the case before this class. So yeah, I think that since this was like kind of a universal experience for a lot of us that were kind of surprised by this information, it's probably something that students will also experience in classes, whether intentionally or not, and whether they already know this or not. So yeah, I wanted to combine a couple of the readings that critically examine curriculum and what students are taught in the classroom. So The Danger of a Single Story TED Talk was something that I was thinking about, and the Challenging the Canon podcast, because both of those talk about critically examining the perspectives that are shown in the classroom, and looking at what kind of resources we provide to students and what perspectives they're allowed to see from the resources that we provide. But I didn't think that either of those were really ones that I wanted to share with students. The Challenging the Canon one was more centered towards teachers anyway, but The Danger of a Single Story has become very popular, so I was just wanting to pick one that was a little bit more, I guess, less common. So I picked the Behind the Lies My Teacher Told Me podcast from Code Switch. In this podcast, the author of The Lies My Teacher Told Me book, I think, was talking about how he was teaching from a textbook in Mississippi that like painted the Reconstructionist time period in a light that made Mississippi look better, instead of telling the full historical accurate truth. So yeah, I wanted to combine all of these ideas of kind of looking critically at curriculum and also examining and challenging what we're taught. So I decided to use those things as like the basis for the lesson. Yeah, I designed this for a middle school classroom, and I'm going to be an English language arts teacher. So this is mostly for middle school language arts class, but I think it could be modified to other grades just depending on the level of scaffolding that you give them and the way that you kind of explain this topic. But yes, I also combined a couple of ideas from the course into picking the activities. So one activity that I'll go into more depth about later is the silent discussion that they'll be doing. The silent discussion allows for students who don't necessarily like to talk out loud in a big class discussion to write down their thoughts rather than speak them, and it also allows for students to have time to actually think and process without moving on as quickly as you do in a regular class discussion, like a Socratic seminar. So that was like the thinking behind that. And then I also just wanted to make the lesson applicable for students with all sorts of different learning preferences. So I included a podcast episode so that they could listen while they read, or if they preferred to read, then they'll have the transcript as well, as I'll explain a little bit more about later. So this gives options for students who have different preferences and styles of learning. I'm also including a creative element for students who don't necessarily show their work best through writing or through speaking or anything like that, so they can show that they've still learned through a creative element, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. But yeah, I think that my project contributes to the course community because, as we've continued to do throughout the semester, we've kind of critically examined what we teach students, and this is like a way to allow your students to do that as well. So it's not just for teachers, but it's for the whole community. And since we've been questioning our educational experiences, I think that students can also question theirs. And then as far as equity and diversity in education as a whole, this project kind of questions whether or not the information that students receive is equitable and diverse, and in many cases we may find that it's not. So this is like kind of a stepping stone for students, at least in their school community, to be able to push back against that and see that there is a more equitable and diverse point of view that they might be able to find access to through looking it up on the internet, for example. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about exactly how this lesson would play out in the classroom. So yeah, these are the instructions for implementation. So the first thing I'll have students do is they will complete an entry ticket when they come in. This kind of just gets their thoughts going. Like I said, I designed this for middle school, and with middle schoolers you kind of have to get their thoughts rolling before you just kind of jump into something like this, and I think that's true for a lot of different students and age groups. So the entry ticket will have them pick one question to respond to. So they'll either talk about, is everything we learn in school true, or they'll answer, do you think that all of your textbooks are completely accurate? And they'll explain their answer. So then they will listen to the episode of the podcast, Behind the Lies My Teacher Told Me. Like I said, I'm also going to print out a copy of the transcript, so they have both. So they're listening, and then they're also, they can also read along. And while they're listening, they'll either have a highlighter or a pencil or something like that, and they can either underline or highlight quotes that stick out to them in some way, or that they have a question about. Just like anything that stands out, they will indicate that on the transcript that they have printed. Yes, and then I'll group them. So ideally you'd have an even number and grouping would be easy, but we know that that's not always true. So I would guess that this would work best for groups of 3 or 4. I've done it in a group of 4 before and it worked well, but you could have bigger groups. It would just take a little bit longer to complete the discussion. But yeah, so students will, once they're in their group, pick out their favorite quote that they highlighted and just write it on the top of a piece of paper. And then they'll have their silent discussion. So if you've never done that before, I'll explain how that works right now. So the first student will have their quote, and everyone in the group will have a quote. So everyone will be passing around their quote. But then once the timer starts, they'll pass it to the next person in the circle. That person will respond to the quote, they'll ask a question, they'll give an example of something that like relates to that quote in some way, and they will write that on the paper underneath the quote, and then they'll pass it all the way around till it gets back to the original person. I was thinking about 5 minutes to write for each quote, so in total this will take like 15 to 20 minutes. So it's kind of a quicker way of doing a discussion, and it allows for students to really gather their thoughts about one topic at a time, which works pretty well. Yes, so then once it gets back to the original person, the group will kind of talk about what they wrote. They'll read through the thoughts that the other students have written on the paper, and they will kind of pick out some things that they see across the quotes, like just kind of read through what information they have available. And then as a whole class, we'll kind of debrief. So I'll ask students to share their thoughts from the silent discussion, from their entry ticket, any other thoughts that they've had that day, And I went ahead and put some guiding questions in here. So like if you're having trouble kind of getting students to talk, you can ask them what things do they want to look at or investigate more, what things they have questions about, what do they want to question, is there something they learned that they're not sure that is completely historically true or accurate. And yeah, so have that whole class share out kind of thing. And then I would give them instructions for the next part. So I'm then going to give them an opportunity to kind of do this investigation themselves. So they'll pick a piece of historical information that they've learned that maybe they think they don't have a clear picture of, something they're just curious about, anything really that they want to research. I would let them have the freedom to do so. And then I have a little handout that says, there's like one little box that says, this is the historical information or event that I want to research, this is the information I know, and this is what I found on the internet. In the podcast, it talks about finding credible and reliable sources. So I would encourage them to look on credible and reliable websites, as well as looking at multiple sources to kind of look at the information that way, to make sure that what they're getting is an accurate picture. Yeah, and then they'll share their information either by making a poster, a brochure, an informational handout. Really, I would let them have a lot of creative freedom with this part. Like I said, I wanted to encourage different learning styles and preferences in the classroom, so I would be open to just about any way that they want to share this information, whether it's like something digitally or it's on paper, or even if it's just a handout explaining the information that they found. That's totally fine with me. Yes, and then depending on the classroom that you're in, you can either have them share it in the whole class, or share it with the school. If it's like a brochure or a poster, they could like share those within the school community. I think it'll really vary on what students choose to do, as well as the school community that you're a part of when you're using this lesson. So yeah, I also said here, like if students are having trouble, maybe if you have one like a historical event in mind that you could share with them. Mine was Brown versus Board, but there are several others in the podcast. He talks about the Reconstructionist time period after the Civil War, so that might be a good place for them to start based on the podcast. So yeah, and then something that we've talked about this semester when it comes to teaching is critical reflection and the importance of reflecting. So I want to give students an opportunity to do this as well. So at the end, they'll just have a little quick write reflection exit ticket where they can just write down their thoughts on the day and yeah, how they think that they can be curious about history and questioning history as they move through their education. I could give suggestions to them if they're stuck, like think about the perspective of all people, how will you make sure you're seeing this, examine the sources that they find. We want to make sure again that they're using credible and reliable sources. So yes, that is my project. And one question, I know that we have a variety of education majors in this class. If you're not ELA, how would you adapt this for your age group or your subject? And if you are ELA, what is a historical event that you think that you could give students as a guiding example? So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.